The reason I have difficulty believing the God of Abraham is the benevolent, all-loving God he is claimed to be is because the practice of slavery appears to be endorsed throughout the Bible. The Bible does not endorse slavery, but slavery was a common practice throughout the ancient world. Slavery often served a vital purpose, such as allowing people to pay off debts, as in the case of indentured servants. Without all the bankruptcy and foreclosure laws as well as debt consolidation companies that we have today, there would have been no way for people living in the ancient world to recover their debts. Before we go any further, I would like to reach an agreement so we can have a basis upon which to build. For the purposes of this discussion, I will agree that the biblical God does exist. Let's also agree that morality is fixed, unchanging, and prescribed by God. And finally, I do not think anyone believes the practice of slavery is actually moral, so let's both agree that the 13th Amendment should be upheld. With that said, if you agree slavery is immoral, what difference would it make how pervasive the practice, or in what fashion slavery was used? Instead of slavery, what if men and women throughout the ancient world used sex as a tool to recover their debts? Would that make the act of premarital sex, or even adultery, any less immoral? Not according to a Christian worldview. Therefore, why do you make such arbitrary concessions when it comes to the practice of slavery? Again, it does not matter in what manner slavery was used, or how much it was ingrained in everyday life, for we have agreed that God defines morality according to fixed absolutes. Therefore, if something is immoral, then it is always immoral. We must be consistent in our understanding of moral principles, for without consistency, morality becomes meaningless. Even though the Bible describes some Israelites and Christians as owning slaves, slavery in biblical times was not the same thing as slavery as it was practiced in America before 1865. In fact, the Bible actually tells Christian masters to treat their slaves with kindness and to look out for their welfare. For example, in Ephesians chapter 6, Paul commands slaves to serve their masters as they would serve Christ and not half-heartedly. This is because, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. Paul goes on to tell the masters to do the same thing for the slaves, and even tells the masters to not threaten their slaves, because, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Yes, but is slavery moral? If you agree that enslaving someone is not a moral practice, then what difference would it make how the slaves were treated? I will refer to my previous analogy of prostitution. What if we could guarantee that prostitutes would only be treated with the utmost respect, in a controlled setting with security, monthly blood screenings, and so on? In fact, we could even legalize prostitution, creating an environment where the only parties involved would be consenting adults, and prostitutes would have full control over the men they choose to be their clients. What does the fact that women are being treated kindly by their brothels have to say about the Christian perception of prostitution? If you believe prostitution is immoral, then it is always immoral, no matter how much we regulate it, limit it, or how well we treat its participants. Likewise, if slavery is immoral, then it is always immoral, no matter how a master might treat his slaves or what are the reasons for enslaving them. There is no justification that can be given to explain away the enslavement of a class or race of people. Even if you, as a slave master, were the kindest slave master in the history of humankind, it would do nothing to legitimize the practice of slavery. You could be the nicest crack dealer in the world as well, but it would not excuse the fact you directly profit from the exploitation of other human beings. Instead of telling Christians to be kind to their slaves, why didn't Paul just come right out and completely denounce the practice of slavery altogether? Paul was not endorsing slavery, but slavery was a reality in ancient Rome, as well as most of the world at that time. Would you prefer Paul to have advised these men to possibly risk their lives by revolting, or possibly be subject to severe punishment under pagan Roman law? Christianity was a new religion, or the fulfillment of Judaism, that looked forward to a redeemed world to come, not a political system to right all the wrongs. Why would Paul have advised the slaves to do anything? Why couldn't Paul advise the slave masters, who retained all the power? Or better yet, simply speak out against slavery as being the moral injustice that it was? Never mind Paul's attempt to regulate slavery by writing letters to the Ephesians. The mere fact this immoral act was allowed to continue in any fashion demonstrates his inhumane indifference to the suffering of millions of innocent people. What if something like bestiality were just as pervasive as slavery? Don't you think Paul would have stood in direct opposition to its practice? Are you really attempting to suggest Jesus and Paul's hands were completely tied with regard to speaking out against the issue of slavery? Let me ask you, are we to expect Christianity to stand up for what is right and just, despite slavery being a common practice? Are we to expect Paul to have spoken out against slavery because it is fundamentally immoral, despite whether or not an anti-slavery position was unpopular for its time? The answer is yes. Is Jesus and the apostles standing up for what is moral and championing the rights of an unjustly persecuted class of people too great an expectation? You claim biblical slavery unjustly persecuted an entire class of people, but how do you even know the form of slavery being practiced by Christians during the time of Jesus was so unjust? The slaves mentioned in the Bible were indentured servants paying off a debt, and as we have already seen, Paul even tells the Ephesians to treat their slaves well. Let's take a look at 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter, one of Jesus' closest apostles, tells slaves to submit to their masters, even those who are harsh. Peter actually uses the words unjust suffering to describe the predicament of the slaves. Here we can plainly see that Peter, in full conscience, knows the act of slavery is unjust and that it causes suffering. Peter even compares the unjust suffering of slaves to the unjust suffering of Christ, and that such suffering is holy in the eyes of God. The slaves being addressed in this passage are not under contract to pay off a debt, for they are being worked and unjustly beaten. Furthermore, there is no attempt to even condemn the unjust beatings. This passage serves to excuse the exploitation of millions of people in bondage, telling them to just deal with their suffering by following the example of Christ. To say that slavery was merely an accepted part of life, and no one was able to speak in direct opposition to this vile practice, is similar to saying something equally absurd, like, because the ancient world widely accepted prostitution and adultery, Christianity could not have taken a firm stance against them, because it was merely an upstart religion with no political affiliation. An objective moral truth is true no matter what time period you happen to live in. If slavery is objectively wrong in the present, then it must have been objectively wrong in the past, according to our previously agreed upon standard of God's fixed moral absolutes. If slavery was indeed viewed as an injustice to Peter, Jesus, or any of the other apostles, as is clearly the case, and they did not do anything to rectify this matter, then they are just as morally accountable as the slave masters. That's called aiding and abetting. You cannot know someone is responsible for a crime and say nothing, or withhold information from the police. Jesus is certainly vocal about his opinions on adultery and murder. In fact, Jesus goes so far as to equate lust with adultery and hate with murder. With such opinionated, conservative views on these two issues, why the apathetic indifference to the issue of slavery? Although Jesus is not recorded as directly addressing the immorality of slavery by name, just because he was not recorded does not mean Jesus never talked about it. I am not in a position to assume anything about any historical figure, especially one living 2,000 years ago. Are you? Therefore, if Jesus' true views on slavery were not recorded, then the point is moot. But we are not discussing the possibility of Jesus having said something. Sure, Jesus could have talked about the immorality of slavery, just as easily as he could have flown to the moon and back. However, we are not discussing hypothetical scenarios. We are discussing the written record, and the very real implications the record had on the suffering of countless millions of men, women, and children at the hands of Christian slave masters. Although it might be true slaves suffered unjustly, as we pointed out in 1 Peter chapter 2, Jesus was ultimately concerned with our eternal destination, not how well life goes in this world. If that is true, then wouldn't performing an immoral act such as slavery lead one down the road to eternal damnation? Was the irrevocable damage to the immortal souls of Christian slave masters of no concern to Jesus Christ? Furthermore, there are no other immoral acts that could be worse than slavery, because for so many people, slavery was a fate much worse than even being murdered. African American literature of the 19th century describes in great detail the magnitude of what many slaves were forced to endure throughout the course of their lives. Slaves were treated like animals that needed to be tamed and their spirits broken, much like the domestication process of wild animals. In fact, the same methods of dehumanization was used by the Nazis in concentration camps during World War II. In reading the works of Frederick Douglass, his fear and desperation are palpable in his recounting of the extreme brutality and senseless acts of violence visited upon him and his fellow slaves as their spirits were shattered. Douglass describes slaves being treated no better than livestock, and in many instances, far, far worse. I have often been awakened by the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and beat her upon her naked back until she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there was hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be witness and participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained fate, the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. It was the most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. But to add insult to injury, after receiving their beatings, the slaves would often be treated to readings from Scripture. This just further demonstrates that these horrendous acts were perpetrated by devout believers in the Christian God, who adamantly adhered to Scripture and justified the practice of keeping slaves through Scripture. Every year brings with it multitudes of this mixed-race class of slaves. It was doubtless in consequence of a knowledge of this fact that one great statesman of the South predicted the downfall of slavery by the inevitable laws of population. Whether this prophecy is ever fulfilled or not, it is nevertheless plain that a very different-looking class of people are springing up at the South, and are now held in slavery from those originally brought to this country from Africa. And if their increase do no other good, it will do away with the force of the argument that God cursed Ham, and therefore American slavery is right. Here Douglass is referring to the common argument taken from the Bible to justify the enslavement of people with darker skin. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, Noah places a curse on Canaan, Ham's son and Noah's grandson. There is no question the form of slavery that was practiced by Americans was very cruel, but how these Christians misused the Bible is not the Bible's fault. The Christians that engaged in the European and American slave trade twisted Scripture to fit their own agenda, and thus were not true Christians. Although it might be true that Christians twisted or reinterpreted the Scripture to fit their own agenda, that would only be the case if the Bible actually bothered speaking in direct opposition to the practice of slavery. With such potential for abuse, Jesus and the apostles could not afford to remain silent on this issue. Surely with the power of omniscience at his command, God could foresee all the pain and suffering at the hands of the American and European slave trades, and how the very same passages Jesus preached and the apostles took down with pen would be used to justify one of the most horrendous evils ever perpetrated upon the earth. Therefore, instead of remaining ambiguous on this subject, and even using slavery to illustrate parables, why didn't Jesus come right out and condemn slavery directly, making no bones about it? Slavery is wrong, and we should not do it. If Jesus had come out in direct opposition to slavery, then at the very least, the ambiguous passages found in the Bible could not have been so easily manipulated in a way as to appear to justify the practice of slavery. Jesus could have easily addressed this issue on numerous occasions, and only he, as the Son of God, was in the unique position to do so.